Ferguson from Shippensburg University, and she's going to be presenting on jamming the major drawers, public image and private thrift in Banff, Scotland.
Yes, hello. All right, hi everyone. It's an honor to be here. I know we have some first-timers here at the CSA. I happen to be one of them. So I will be discussing writing habits, menswear, and 18th century culture based on a receipt we found dated 1779 from Banff, Scotland. And it's titled Jamming the Major's Drawers. Scholars buy and study books for the information on the printed pages, but sometimes what is between the pages is equally intriguing. Dr. Bollocky of the Fashion Archives and Museum found a receipt tucked inside a used book she purchased for a personal reference library. Featured here is the actual receipt, written by James Hall, the tailor, for Lady Johnston, billing her for work completed. The receipt was written and dated in a town called Banff, Scotland, in 1779. How a Scottish receipt from the 18th century ended up in an early 20th century French book is an unsolvable mystery. 18th century fashion showcased the social environment and livelihood of the area, where expensive clothing needed experienced tailoring both in urban and remote areas. The town in Banff, and I quote, boasted prosperity closely linked to its status as a trading port. Records indicate that many tradesmen worked in the town, including a significant number of tailors. In 1779, tailor James Hall submitted an invoice indicating he had turned a habit belonging to a Lady Johnston. He also jammed 2 pairs of drawers for Major Johnston, charging for some supplies in the process. Information about the family, the tailor, and the town of Banff will reveal more about 18th century travel habits, economy, and how locals obtained their fashion information. This receipt illustrates physical practices of thrift in fashion in rural Scotland, which grew into a major trading port because of significant changes that took place during the 1770s. The town of Banff is located on the coast in northern Scotland, bordering the North Sea of Aberdeenshire. This means it is on the northeastern side of Scottish coast. As a result of its location, a distinct maritime history developed, opening the region to a vigorous shipping trade throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. But in the 17th century, shifting sandbanks had caused difficulties. This motivated the construction of the town's first harbor, which was extended in 1775. Now this really opened the way for increased trade. And ultimately, it was the sea that shaped Banff, turning it into a bustling port city by the late 1770s. A general and global increase in the economy took place at this time anyway. New and imported fashion styles and textile designs would have reached Banff by the date of this receipt. As well as an extended harbor, the neighboring town of Macduff had a massive bridge built in 1779, same year as the receipt. Previously, access to this town had been blocked by the famously unpredictable River Devon. So this massive bridge literally bridged the gap between the two towns, allowing for more inland travel and access to a larger consumer market. Lady Johnston would have enjoyed this expansion for her own textile needs. It is common knowledge that women during this time measured their wealth, aside from their husbands' finances, in the clothing they owned. Therefore, knowledge of Lady Johnston would be both beneficial and highly interesting. The name Johnston is quite common in the area, and because there were also several majors, it is difficult to pin down her exact identity. Her turned writing habit was the most expensive item featured on the receipt, with a total cost of 5 shillings. The receipt indicates that Lady Johnston also needed a ribbon for 1 shilling, and the tailor used silk thread and twist for 2 shillings. Additionally, the tailor mended some drawers belonging to, presumably her husband, Major Johnston. This cost a mere 6 pence. it is somewhat surprising that the riband was so expensive, suggesting that Lady Johnston did not stint when accessorizing her riding habit. Lady Johnston's desire to have her habit serviced could have been because the gown had sentimental value, or it could have been purely economical. Making a riding habit cost tremendously more than turning one. Barbara Johnston furnishes a prime example of this in her famous album. In 1760, she received a gift of pompadour broadcloth from her brother to make a riding habit, which required her to spend a further £8 on the services of a maker. The corresponding bill from a London haberdasher and habit maker named Henry Paulin broke down the additional cost it required to convert this length of fabric into a riding habit. In that gown alone, there were 24 silver buttons, 7 yards of silver binding, buck ram, and lining fabrics. Then the making of the habit itself and a contrasting waistcoat. In total, Barbara's outlay far exceeded her brother's original intended gift. This may explain Lady Johnston's concerted effort to preserve her habit. Essentially a dress for active sport, riding habits were increasingly worn also for traveling and informal outdoor leisure wear. By the late 1700s, ladies even rode to parties, only to dance also in the same dress. Made by tailors instead of dressmakers, they were expensive to make and trim. Consisting of a tailored coat, sometimes having 2 skirts, one ankle length for walking and a longer one for riding. In addition, the well-dressed young sportswoman donned a riding hat, either a smart and expensive feather-trimmed beaver or a more utilitarian protected padded one. Habit shirts and stocks, and perhaps a lightweight riding corset or jump, completed the ensemble. Now, Lady Johnston belonged to the higher class echelon, that she could 1. Afford a riding habit, 2. Afford to get turned, and 3. Afford a horse to ride, confirms this. The public appearance of Lady Johnston riding through the countryside would have been a sure sign of status for her family. Politically, financially, and socially, this showed any onlookers that she represented the Johnston household in style. This is interesting because sometimes women were forbidden from riding horseback by their husbands. This was clearly not the case for Lady Johnston. It would seem both her husband and her culture allowed her to have significant freedoms. However, if she did come from a socially prominent background, why then did she need to save costs by having her habit turned rather than simply purchasing a new one? If she could not afford a new habit, then this opens up fresh questions regarding the state of her domestic finances. Inclusion in the gentry was a combination of birth, land, and perceived financial stability. Unless she felt particular affection for the garment, why she needed to have it turned indicates she was perhaps in some financial straits. It seems clear Lady Johnston felt more confident getting the tailoring she did as opposed to buying a new skirt or jacket, giving us a clue into the world of a Scottish officer's wife. Furthermore, as Lady Johnston maintained her habit, she recognized its value. She deemed fixing it up an investment worth the cost. Alexandra Shepherd wrote in Accounting for Oneself that it was common practice throughout the 17th and 18th centuries of England to judge someone's social class by, and I quote, the possession of nothing more than a pair of their clothes. Lady Johnston's desire to keep her habit meant she likely valued it as an outward indication of her own personal credit. Donning traditional riding attire, suits akin to men's long velvet coats with lace trimmings and plush caps decked with feathers, must have brought her a level of comfort and pride. Worth mentioning also, it was fashionable for aristocrats in the late 18th century to wear riding habits based on military uniforms, often those of their husbands' regiments as a gesture of patriotism. In fact, the wars of the 1770s made it fashionable to have a military look in one's riding habit overall. This might have been the case for Lady Johnston, whose husband, of course, was a major. Red was increasingly popular, modeled after the British Army uniform. Habits were also made to look like the uniforms of specific regiments. Had this been the case for Lady Johnston, it would certainly explain why she wished to preserve that particular habit rather than replace it. In the end, owning such a specialized item fit the criteria for what it meant to be comfortably wealthy. It is also worth noting that riding offered many women a sense of open-air freedom. in a pastime more generally preserved for men. Lady Johnston, by sporting fine clothes and writing skills, clearly enjoyed both, whilst still being careful with her significant fashion investment. Now, Major Johnston. As well as being the male counterpart to Mrs. Johnston, Major Johnston has a military background to uncover. To make something clear, there is no definitive indication that the Major mentioned in the receipt was her husband. He may have been a son or brother, but since a woman like Lady Johnston often managed the clothing and related expenses of the household, it is a reasonable assumption that he was her husband. His only piece of clothing mentioned in the receipt are his drawers, of which the tailor jammed 2 pairs. It turns out this term jammed, which is where my research began, this term jammed, or to jam something, is antiquated Scottish slang for patching. Hence, Lady Johnston had his drawers patched for 6 pence. This suggests that sewing was not Lady Johnston's talent, and there were no other servants in the household with the requisite needle skills to keep the state of the Major's worn or damaged drawers a private household matter. They are not a dignified garment to think about, in contrast to the rest of his military regalia. His identity also makes him of interest when considering the military concern of the town, especially since this took place during the height of the American War for Independence. In 1778, Charles, Duke of Gordon, raised a regiment to defend the area of Banff and its neighboring areas from maritime attack. The Duke's estate included the town of Banff. Dubbed the Gordon Fencibles, the regiment consisted of 960 soldiers, and the unit was disbanded in 1783 with the end of the American War. Uncovering the Major's military uniform, which he likely sported at formal occasions, permits some enjoyable speculation. As he was presumably Scottish or Anglo-Scottish, it is easy to imagine him in a kilt, but everyone knows what men in kilts do not wear under their plaids. The presence of drawers in his wardrobe suggests Major Johnston wore breeches. Drawers for men at this time were very much a reflection of personal preference. It is believed that the Highlander foot soldiers may have worn kilts on duty, but largely British officers did not wear kilts, particularly since the traditional tartans were banned from 1745 to 1782. As seen here, these officers, comprising a large number of Scots, Highlanders, in addition to British officers, are riding horseback in breeches. The main military forces in Banff during the 1770s were a mix of foot regiments. Most likely, our major was an officer of the Gordon Fencibles. Stana Nenadic, in her work The Impact of the Military Profession on Highland Gentry Families, shed some light on how Major Johnston would have lived in Banff at the time this receipt was written. According to her, there was a peak in the number of military officers enlisted, with many coming from the Highland gentry. By 1779, there was often fear of military action in Banff, particularly coming from the sea. During the American Revolution, the threat of American privateer ships stalking the coast would have left Major Johnston and his counterparts on edge. In 1777, for instance, there was a privateer named the Tartar from Boston. It had captured a Banff naval vessel that same year. Local enforcement expressed in their letters that they felt uneasy living in any gentrified housing, as they believed they would be, and I quote, burnt and plundered should any privateers reach the shore. In response to this and similar threats, 9 cannons were installed along the coast to protect the town, with several soldiers stationed along with them. Assuming he was in active service at the time, Major Johnston would have been involved in these decisions and actions. We know he was present in Banff at the time of the receipt in 1779, living in relative domestic stability, enough for his wife to get their clothes mended, and indeed, he felt she was safe with him. So there was some safety there. It is a reasonable conclusion that he remained in Banff throughout the war. This shows that even in times of war, life goes on, business continues, and the wife of an officer may still utilize the services of a tailor. The tailor in question was James Hall. He seemed a popular tradesman in Banff, judging by his customers. As a period tailor and local businessman, he worked during one of the most interesting times in Banff history. He would have seen the effect the American War had on the textile trade, particularly in the wake of the American textile boycotts. He would have enjoyed the consumer trade brought on by the bridge built over the River Devron. He would have also seen an influx of soldiers in town because of the war, some of whom he may have tailored for as well. If his business did flourish at this time, Hall would have been classed as a middling sort of merchant. He was clearly an expert in his trade, given that he turned a lady's riding habit. Not unlike many tailors of the time, he ran his tailoring business out of a shop owned by another. In this case, it was a local proprietor named John Sligo. Hall was also a tradesman during an interesting time for tailors in general throughout the Aberdeen area. Social progress had taken place as Aberdeenshire, which included Banff, became the first trade association to allow women into the profession. Previously, men had worried that women would encroach on their business. However, concessions were now open for the female market to tailor to lady customers. This was the only area in Scotland that allowed this. In this case, while Hall likely did the work himself, he was at the center of this social progress. Hall would have been well paid for by his higher-class customers as well, since professionals usually received payment on a per-item basis rather than receiving a salary or wage. A tailor like Hall would comfortably live on the payments he received, assuming they paid their bills on time, especially after there was an influx of gentry and soldiers in the area by 1779. In conclusion, the receipt, dated August 23, 1779, was paid in full the following month on September 2nd. Lady Johnston settled her accounts promptly, which is not necessarily common among the gentry. This was dated some 3.5 years after the extension of the harbor, and the same year that a great bridge was built connecting to the nearest town. This receipt was also written during the peak of activity from the American War for Independence. It was an exciting year for Banff, a story not immediately obvious upon reading this receipt. Lady Johnston, with her writing habit, gives us many details into her life. That she needed it turned indicates there was wear and tear, thus saying much about her travel routine, which was adventurously done from horseback. If not a local resident, Major Johnston may have been stationed at the town of Banff to oversee its protection and fortifications against American privateers. That Tailor Hall serviced the Johnstons indicates that he likely tailored for the gentry and was therefore a permanent resident, witness to the slew of significant local and social changes. This receipt has provided a small glimpse into the outward performance of social class and thrift in rural Scotland in the tumultuous and exciting time of the 18th century. Thank you.